Charleston, South Carolina, 1839. In the heart of the city where magnolia perfume mingled with the salt of the harbor, a woman named Eleanor Whitford kept her curtains closed and her conscience cleaner than her hands. They called her the Charleston widow. Once, her family had been the pride of King Street. Her late husband, a shipping merchant, had built his fortune ferrying cotton and sugar between the Carolinas and the West Indies. When he died, Eleanor inherited both his debts and his property, including the human ones. Her plantation near Goose Creek had long since rotted into ruin. Her income came now from the selling of house servants, bred on those very lands, some descended from women her husband had purchased, some born of the family's own dark seed. Eleanor didn't flinch at the whispers. "A woman must make her own peace with God," she said, "and her own arrangements with man." What no one spoke of openly was the scandal behind her fortune, the daughters she had raised like porcelain dolls, and the children they had borne in silence. Some said she kept them hidden to protect them. Others said she sold them to save herself. Both were true. The summer heat had turned the harbor air thick and sweet, heavy enough to taste. From her parlor window, Eleanor Whitford watched the steamboats chug along the water, their smoke rising like prayers that never reached heaven. On the writing desk before her lay an open ledger, the ink still wet from this morning's entries. Names, dates, numbers, a merchant's list. But these weren't cargo or crates. These were people. She read each line carefully, mouthing the syllables as if they were verses from scripture. Is greater than Clara, aged 17, $325. Joseph, infant male, $45. Her hand paused. The ink bled slightly where her pen trembled. Joseph, her grandson. Outside, the cicadas screamed in the oaks. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to quiet the noise. The house was full of ghosts. Her husband's footsteps still creaked on the stairwell. Her daughter's laughter still echoed in the nursery she'd locked years ago. But today, it wasn't the dead who haunted her. It was the living. A carriage arrived in the courtyard just past noon, its wheels crunching over the gravel. Eleanor turned to the window as Mr. Barnaby Trask, her broker, stepped out, hat in hand and sweat shining on his brow. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called through the open doorway. "Got a buyer from Savannah interested in your house stock. Says he prefers light-skinned girls for house service." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You'll speak more quietly in my home, Mr. Trask." He tipped his hat, smirking. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Only repeating what's asked." Eleanor closed the ledger and rose, her silk dress whispering like dry leaves. "Which girl?" "Clara, ma'am. The younger one." Her throat constricted. Clara, her daughter's child. Born in the attic one winter when her eldest, Margaret, was too sick to rise from bed. Eleanor had paid the midwife to disappear the birth record. She told everyone the baby had died before dawn. But the child hadn't died. She had grown slender, quiet, with the same gray eyes as Eleanor's late husband. And now, 17 years later, she was worth $325. "Tell your buyer I'll consider it," Eleanor said coldly. Trask grinned, sliding a folded paper across the table. "Contract's ready when you are." When he left, Eleanor stood motionless by the window, clutching the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. Somewhere in the house, the faint sound of a humming voice drifted through the hallway, the tune soft, steady, and heartbreakingly familiar. It was Clara, singing to the child in her arms. Eleanor followed the sound up the narrow servant staircase, each step creaking under her weight. At the end of the corridor, sunlight poured through a half-open door. Inside, Clara rocked a baby in her lap, little Joseph, his tiny fist clutching a bit of ribbon. The air smelled of milk and soap. When Clara saw her, she froze. "Grandmother." "Child," Eleanor said quietly. "You should be resting. I can't rest when he cries." She smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "He likes when I sing." Eleanor's eyes softened despite herself. "That song, where did you learn it?" "Mama used to sing it," Clara whispered. Before she went away, Eleanor swallowed hard. "Yes, she did." Clara looked up, hesitant. "Will you ever tell me where she went?" The widow's hand brushed the doorframe. She went where all good souls go when the world's been too cruel to them. Clara nodded, though she didn't understand. And Joseph? Will he stay with me? Eleanor's breath caught. The question hung like smoke. Of course, she lied. He'll be safe. She turned before her voice could betray her. The moment she stepped into the hall, the hum of Clara's lullaby started again, low and sweet, like a prayer meant for a child who would never see manhood under his own name. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat before the cold hearth, ledger open once more, her candle guttering in the draught. The names stared back at her. Each one was a weight, a sin, a coin spent in desperation. She told herself it was survival, that the debts her husband left behind demanded it, that Charleston society would tear her apart if they knew the truth that her grandchildren bore the same blood as those she sold. But no matter how she reasoned, the ink refused to dry clean. At midnight, the clock struck 12. From upstairs came the sound of a baby crying. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth, eyes wet, whispering to no one, "Hush now, Joseph. You'll sleep soon." But she knew the truth by morning. The broker would return, and the carriage that came for her debt would take more than silver. It would take blood. The following morning dawned gray and windless. The city was quiet, its cobblestone streets slick from the night's thin rain. From her balcony, Eleanor Whitford watched the carriages roll past the wrought iron gates, each carrying merchants and ministers toward Sunday sermons. Bells tolled faintly in the distance, the sound of repentance, but it reached her house too late. In her study, the ledger lay open again. One new entry had been added during the night. Is greater than Joseph infant, mulatto sold to Mr. P. Cartwright of Savannah, $45 received in full. Her handwriting was precise, as always. Not a single tremor betrayed the truth behind the line. Downstairs, the sound of wheels crunching over gravel broke the silence. The broker, Mr. Barnaby Trask, had returned with the buyer. Eleanor stood in her black silk gown, every button fastened to the throat. She met them in the parlor, her eyes cold as polished steel. "Mr. Cartwright," she greeted stiffly. "I trust your journey was comfortable." The man, tall, ruddy-faced, reeking of tobacco and arrogance, bowed slightly. "Long, but worth it, Mrs. Whitford. I hear you've got fine house stock, well-trained, pretty." Eleanor's lips barely moved. "I deal in quality, not gossip." He smiled, showing a gold tooth. "Of course. And the babe?" Her hand trembled at her side. "Upstairs. Sleeping." "Fetch him then," Cartwright said, pulling out his coin pouch. Trask shifted uneasily. "Ma'am, maybe best if I—" But Eleanor silenced him with a look. "I'll see to it myself." She climbed the staircase slowly, each step heavier than the last. The nursery door was ajar. Inside, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hair undone, humming softly to the infant in her arms. When she looked up and saw her grandmother, her face lit with fragile hope. "He finally slept, grandmother. I think the fever's broken." Eleanor stood in the doorway, unable to speak for a moment. She took in the sight, the fragile girl, the small bundle against her chest, the faint smell of lavender and milk. The candlelight flickered. For a heartbeat, she saw another figure there, her eldest daughter, Margaret, as she had been years ago, pale, trembling, clutching a newborn and whispering, "Mama, please don't tell him." And worry. History was repeating itself, and Eleanor, once again, was the hand that would turn the wheel. She stepped closer. "Clara," she said softly, "Mr. Trask has come. There's a family, willing to take the boy." Clara frowned. "Take him? For what?" Eleanor forced a smile. "For better care. They have means medicine, food, servants. You're too young, child. He'll have a chance there." Clara rose, her arms tightening around the baby. "You said he'd stay with me." "I said he'd be safe." "Safe here," Clara cried, her voice breaking. "He's all I have." Eleanor's jaw set. "And he's all I have to give." The girl backed away, clutching the infant as though her heartbeat could shield him. "No, please, you can't." Eleanor's face twisted with something between fury and grief. "Do you think I want this?" she hissed. "Do you think I sleep easy, knowing what must be done to keep this house standing?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, then let it fall. Those words struck like a slap. For a moment, neither moved. The baby whimpered between them. Then, from below, came the sound of Trask's impatient voice. "Time's wasting, ma'am." Eleanor turned away. "Get the child ready." Clara did not answer. When Eleanor returned to the parlor 10 minutes later, her composure had hardened like marble. Trask stood by the window, while Cartwright counted coins into her waiting palm. $45, Cartwright said. "Not a cent more for a half-blood infant. You know how folk talk." Eleanor nodded mechanically, sliding the pouch into her desk drawer. Then Clara appeared in the doorway, her hair wild, her face streaked with tears, but her arms were empty. Eleanor froze. "Where is he?" Clara's voice was calm now, almost eerily so. "Gone." Trask stepped forward. "Gone where?" "To his father," she said simply. The room went still. Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Clara looked her grandmother square in the eye. "You lied all my life. You told me Mama went away because she was sick. But I found her letters, hidden in the chest. She begged you not to sell her children, and you did it anyway." Eleanor's mouth opened, no words came. Clara went on, her voice shaking with fury. "So I did what she couldn't. I sent Joseph away before you could trade him like a bolt of cloth. He's gone, far from you. You'll never touch him." Trask swore under his breath. "Ma'am, if the buyer finds out—" "Out!" Eleanor snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Trask and Cartwright hesitated, then fled under the weight of her glare. The door slammed behind them. Eleanor turned back to Clara, trembling. "What have you done? What you never could?" Clara whispered. "I saved him." Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for her. "Do you know what you've done to me?" Clara took a step back. "To you, or to yourself?" The widow's voice cracked. "You ungrateful child. Everything I've done, every coin, every lie, it was for you." "For me?" Clara cried. "You sold my mother's blood. You'd sell mine too if the price was right." The silence that followed was unbearable. Eleanor raised her hand, then let it fall, too weary even for anger. "Get out of my sight," she whispered, "before I damn you the way I damned her." "80s." Clara didn't move at first. Then she bowed her head and walked out, leaving the door swinging in her wake. That night, thunder rolled across the harbor. Eleanor sat in the dark parlor, the coins from Cartwright still gleaming on the table. The house felt emptier than ever. She tried to tell herself it was mercy that she had saved them all from poverty, from ruin. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had traded her bloodline for survival, and as lightning flashed across the sky, she thought she saw a figure reflected in the window, her eldest daughter, Margaret, pale and silent, holding a child in her arms. The apparition stared at her, lips moving soundlessly, before fading into the glass. Eleanor whispered to the empty room. It was never enough, was it? Outside, the storm broke open, and the wind carried a single sound through the shutters, a lullaby. The same one Clara had sung to her son. The same one Eleanor hadn't heard since the night she sold her daughter's firstborn. The song of the women she'd betrayed echoing back to claim their debt. The storm that had swept through Charleston the night before left the city washed and hollow. The air smelled of salt and smoke. The harbor still churned from restless tides. But inside the Whitford mansion, no wind stirred. It was a mausoleum of polished wood and silent rooms. Eleanor sat in her study again, her ink bottle uncapped, her hand trembling above the ledger. The line for Joseph had already begun to fade, the wet air bleeding the ink like a wound that refused to close. Her servants moved quietly, speaking only in whispers. Even they had heard the story how the young mistress had vanished before dawn, taking only a shawl and a small bundle. Some said they'd seen her crossing the causeway by lantern light. Others claimed a ship bound for Nassau had sailed before sunrise, with a pale woman crying on its deck. Eleanor dismissed the rumors, though her chest ached with the weight of them. "Foolish girl," she muttered to herself. "She'll be back when the hunger comes." But deep down, something told her otherwise. That afternoon, a visitor arrived unannounced. The butler hesitated before opening the door. It was Reverend Halcott, the same minister who had officiated Eleanor's husband's funeral years ago. He stepped inside, his Bible tucked beneath his arm, his hat dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. "Mrs. Whitford," he said gravely, "I came because there's talk in the parish about your granddaughter." Eleanor turned from the window. "Talk is all this city ever has, Reverend." "What is it this time?" He cleared his throat. "That she's gone north. That she carried a child not fit for society's eyes. And that you, in your grief, tried to rid yourself of the shame." Eleanor's lips tightened. "Do you come as a preacher, or as one of the gossips?" Halcott looked at her with weary eyes. "As a man who's seen what pride does to a soul, ma'am. The Lord don't bless those who sell what's his." Her voice went sharp. "I have given more to his church than any family in this quarter. I have kept this house standing when men twice my strength would have failed." "And what did you lose to keep it standing?" he asked softly. Eleanor turned away, her knuckles white around her shawl. "Everything," he sighed. "Then perhaps it's time to stop fighting the ghosts you made." She didn't answer. When the Reverend left, the house seemed to darken. The clock ticked louder. The mirror in the hall reflected her face, but behind it, just for an instant, she thought she saw Clara, watching her. Days passed. No letters came, no word from the city watch. Then, one morning, a package arrived at the door addressed in a familiar hand. Eleanor's heart stumbled. She broke the seal, unfolding a sheet of coarse paper. "Is greater than grandmother. He's safe. We're safe. The world beyond Charleston is not kind, but it's freer than your house ever was. I forgive you, though I'll never understand you. Tell no one where we've gone. When you hear the gulls at dusk, think of us. Clara." Something small tumbled from the envelope and clinked onto the floor, a locket, silver and tarnished. Inside was a sketch of a baby's face. On the back, engraved in rough letters, "To Mama." Eleanor sank into her chair, the letter trembling in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt the ache of something she couldn't bury under ledgers or coins regret. But Charleston was not a forgiving city. By week's end, the whispers grew louder. The market traders gossiped openly. "Did you hear? The Whitford granddaughter ran off with a mulatto child. Her grandmother's gone mad, they say. Keeps talking to shadows. Some say she's cursed, sold too much of her own blood." Eleanor ignored them, or tried to. But when she ventured into town to pay her creditors, even the merchants turned their eyes away. The woman who once commanded respect now carried the scent of scandal. That night, she dined alone in the grand hall. The candlelight danced across the portraits of her ancestors, stern men, smiling wives, children painted in lace and pearls. She looked at them and whispered, "You all built your names on lies. I only followed your lesson." Then, from the corner of the room, she heard a faint hum. It was a lullaby. The same song Clara had sung. Eleanor froze. The sound came from upstairs. Slowly, she rose, candle trembling in her hand, and climbed the staircase. The nursery door was ajar. The cradle sat in the middle of the room, rocking ever so slightly. She stepped closer, whispering, "Clara?" The cradle stopped. When she leaned in, she saw the locket, the one Clara had sent her, resting on the blanket. But it was open now, and inside, the sketch was gone. A cold breath of wind brushed her neck. The candle flickered out, and in the darkness, a voice whispered soft, childlike, yet echoing like the sea, "You can't sell what's already yours." Eleanor stumbled back, her heart pounding. The room was empty. The hum was gone. She fled downstairs, gasping for air, gripping the locket to her chest. When she reached the parlor, the clock struck midnight. The sound rolled through the house like a toll for the dead. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor rarely left her room. The servants found her wandering the halls at night, murmuring apologies to no one. She ordered the nursery locked, but sometimes the cradle would still be rocking when dawn came. The city moved on. Ships came and went, new fortunes rose, while old names faded into dust. But every evening, when the gulls cried over the harbor, a woman in black could be seen standing on the Whitford balcony, staring toward the sea. And those who passed by swore they heard her whispering a child's name softly, endlessly, until the sound blended with the waves. Spring arrived in Charleston like a cruel joke. The magnolias bloomed white and heavy, their sweetness clinging to the air. But the Whitford mansion stood gray and still, like a tomb refusing the season's warmth. Eleanor rarely left her room now. Her hair had turned nearly white, and her once proud shoulders bent beneath years she hadn't yet lived. Her servants tiptoed past her door, whispering prayers when they thought she couldn't hear. But she always did. She heard everything, the creak of the stair, the faint echoes of laughter that didn't belong to anyone alive, the lullaby that drifted down the hall some nights when the tide was high. And she heard the city's gossip. It came like rot through the walls. Mrs. Whitford's granddaughter bore a bastard. She sold her own kin to cover debts. They say the ghosts won't let her sleep. Rumor had finally turned from whisper to weapon. The church ladies who once sipped tea in her parlor now crossed the street to avoid her. Even the banker who had once bowed to her carriage refused to call. Then, one morning, a knock came at her door, hard and official. The butler hesitated to answer, but Eleanor, draped in mourning black, though no one had died that week, lifted her chin. "Let them in," she said. Two men entered, wearing the gray coats of city assessors. One was young, his face freshly shaven and full of pity. The other was old, his voice sharp as iron. "Mrs. Whitford," the older one began, "the court has reviewed your case. Your debts have surpassed your holdings. The estate must be liquidated." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "Liquidated? You mean stolen?" "It means, ma'am, that everything of value, property, land, and assets will be auctioned, including—" He hesitated. "Your remaining servants." She turned her face toward the window, toward the river where ships rocked gently in the harbor. "Do what you must," she said coldly, "but you'll not find them here. They left long ago." The young man frowned. "All of them?" Eleanor's mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ghosts don't sign ledgers." The auction took place a week later in the courthouse square. Charleston's finest gathered under the blazing sun, merchants, widows, planters, even those who'd once curtsied to Eleanor Whitford in her glory. They came not to honor her, but to devour what remained. The items from her mansion, mirrors, silverware, portraits of long-dead ancestors, were carried out one by one and placed on display. The auctioneer's voice boomed, calling out prices as hands lifted greedily in the crowd. £2 sterling for the dining set, $3 for the grandfather clock, $10 for the Whitford family Bible. Eleanor stood on the edge of the crowd, veiled and silent. No one greeted her. No one dared. Then came the final lot. A small wooden cradle, its edges worn smooth by time. The auctioneer hesitated. "Item from the nursery, no known value. Opening bid." Before he could finish, the cradle began to rock. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. Wood against wood, a rhythm like breath. The crowd stilled. The auctioneer swallowed, his voice faltering. "Is someone—" No one moved. Then a child's hum filled the air. It was faint, almost carried by the wind, but Eleanor heard it, clear as a bell, the same lullaby Clara had sung to the baby, the same one that had haunted her nights. People began to murmur, crossing themselves, backing away. "The devil's in it," someone whispered. "Burn it. Throw it in the river." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "No," she said. "It stays." The auctioneer blinked. "Ma'am? The sale?" "I said it stays." Her voice cracked like thunder. The hum ceased. The cradle stilled. Eleanor turned to face the crowd, pulling back her veil. Her eyes, cold, bright, and hollow, met theirs. "Do you all think you're better than me?" she said. "You sold souls, same as I did. You dressed it in scripture, called it trade. But I—" Her voice wavered. "I sold what I loved. That's why you're here, to watch me punished." No one spoke. She reached into her bodice and drew out the locket. "This," she said, opening it with trembling fingers, "belonged to my granddaughter. She was my last mercy, and I cast her out like refuse. Now you'll all see what mercy costs." A sudden gust tore through the square, slamming shutters, scattering papers. The cradle tipped, and inside, for just an instant, the crowd saw a tiny handprint pressed into the wood. Screams rippled through the market. People fled, tripping over benches, calling for the constables. But Eleanor only smiled faintly. her hair wild in the wind. "You can't bury truth," she whispered. "It grows." That night, when the city quieted, the auctioneer returned to the square to collect what was left. But the cradle was gone. Only a silver locket lay where it had stood, glinting in the moonlight. And far out over the harbor, a single lantern flickered on a small boat drifting toward the sea. Some said they saw a woman aboard, her hair loose, her hands cradling something invisible, singing softly to the waves. Others swore it was only the wind through the marsh reeds. Weeks later, the Whitford mansion was stripped bare. Ivy crept across the shutters, the garden choked with weeds. Children dared each other to run past at night. And sometimes, they said, a voice would drift from the upper windows. "Hush, little one. The tide will take us home." The Charleston widow who once sold her own blood had become what the city always feared most, a ghost that remembered. And though the world forgot her name, every spring, when the magnolias bloomed, the gulls would cry above the harbor, and their song sounded just like her lullaby. 30 years had passed since the night the cradle rocked itself in the square. Charleston had changed its skin, its streets cobbled smoother, its markets rebuilt, its ghosts politely forgotten. But the whispers never left. They lived in the cracks between bricks, in the hush of church bells at dusk, in the smell of salt that rolled in from the harbor. And on a humid spring evening, when the sky turned copper before rain, a carriage stopped before the old Whitford gate. The driver climbed down and opened the door. A woman stepped out, tall, wrapped in traveling black, her hair streaked with silver but her eyes sharp as flame. Her name was Clara Whitford, though few in Charleston would have recognized her now. To the city, she had died long ago, sold, vanished, erased. But she had come back, and with her came a young man, his skin the warm bronze of the Carolina sun, his hands calloused, his gaze steady. He was her son, Isaac, the last living thread of a family that had been broken for profit. They stood before the mansion gate, its iron twisted with rust and vines. A single plank hung from one hinge, the old W carved faintly into the wood. Isaac looked up at it and said quietly, "This where she lived?" Clara nodded. "This where she died." He frowned. "You mean your grandmother?" Clara didn't answer. Her gaze drifted over the grounds, the overgrown path, the empty windows, the ivy crawling up the pillars like fingers reclaiming stone. "I mean the house," she said at last. "It died before she did." They entered through the garden gate. The air smelled of rain and old secrets. Inside, the mansion stood hollow. Dust lay thick as velvet across the floors. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, their faces faded, their eyes blind. The grand staircase creaked beneath their steps as if remembering each sin that had climbed it. Isaac lit a lantern. "Feels like something's still breathin' in here," he murmured. Clara smiled faintly. "That's because something is." She led him to the parlor, where the ashes of a long, cold fire still rested in the grate. There, half buried beneath a layer of dust, she found what she'd hoped for, a small silver locket, dulled with age but unmistakable. She opened it. Inside, a miniature portrait of her mother, painted before shame had hardened her. Clara touched it gently, then looked toward the staircase. "She wasn't all evil," she said. "She was afraid. And fear, once it learns to rule, don't ever give up power." Isaac studied her in the dim light. "You came back to forgive her?" Clara shook her head. "I came back to finish what she started." That night, thunder rolled in from the coast. Rain struck the shutters like fists. Clara walked the halls with a candle, tracing her fingers along the peeling wallpaper. Every step she took echoed like memory. When she reached the nursery door, she stopped. It hung slightly open. The room inside was still. The cradle stood where it always had, though the wood was warped with time. And there, pressed into its side, was the faint shape of a child's handprint, untouched by dust. Clara knelt before it. "You were supposed to be safe here," she whispered. "But the world don't keep promises to women or children, only to money." The candle flickered. Somewhere behind her, floorboards sighed. "Who's there?" Isaac's voice came from the doorway. Before she could answer, the air changed, thickened. The scent of magnolia filled the room, cloying and heavy. Then came a sound, the soft hum of a lullaby. Isaac froze. "Mama, you hear that?" Clara nodded slowly. "It's her." The candle flame bent sideways, though there was no wind. The mirror on the wall clouded, and for a moment, a figure appeared in it, a woman in black, pale as ash, her hair loose, her eyes hollow and endless. Eleanor Whitford. Clara rose, her voice trembling but firm. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" The figure tilted her head. The lullaby stopped. "You sold my blood," Clara said. "You sold your own salvation." The ghost's mouth moved, but no sound came. Isaac reached for his mother's arm. "Let's leave, Mama. This place ain't for the livin'." But Clara stepped forward. "No, not till she hears me." She lifted the locket. "You thought you could cleanse your name with gold, but it only bought you chains that never break. You wanted to save your legacy. Well, here it is. Look at him." She turned to Isaac, whose lantern burned steady against the storm. "Your grandson, the one your greed tried to erase." For a heartbeat, the ghost stilled. Then, slowly, it lowered its head. The mirror's surface rippled. A whisper rose not in anger, but in grief. "Forgive me." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "I can't," she said softly, "but I can let you rest." She placed the locket into the cradle. The handprint beneath it began to fade, dissolving into the wood like breath into air. The storm outside eased. The candle flared once and went still. When Clara looked up again, the mirror was empty. At dawn, the rain stopped. Light spilled across the harbor, painting the city gold. Isaac and Clara stood on the balcony, the mansion quiet behind them. "What'll we do now?" he asked. "Sell the house," she said. "But not to the kind who buy souls. Maybe to someone who'll plant gardens where cruelty used to grow." He nodded. "And you? You going to stay?" She smiled faintly. "No. Charleston remembers too much. But someone has to write it down, what she did, what we lost, what we became." Isaac grinned. "Then I'll make sure folks read it." Clara looked out at the harbor, where the morning fog lifted slow as mercy. Maybe then she'll finally sleep. That night, as the city quieted again, a single window glowed in the old Whitford mansion. Inside, the cradle sat empty save for the locket, which gleamed once under the moonlight before going still forever. And in the garden below, magnolias bloomed, their scent rising sweet through the air, not of sorrow this time, but of release. For the first time in half a century, the house did not hum with regret. It listened, it remembered, and it forgave. 15 years later, the world outside Charleston had grown louder railroads, new cities, and a South trying to forget what it once was. But memory, like swamp water, never really dries. It only waits for rain. Isaac Whitford, now a man with silver threading his curls, returned to Charleston not as a ghost but as a historian. He carried under his arm a book, bound in faded leather and stitched by his own hands. Its title, embossed in gold leaf, read, "The Ledger of Names, the true account of the Whitford bloodline." The train hissed behind him as he stepped onto the platform. The same salty wind from the harbor brushed his coat. The city had been rebuilt again, yet he could still see the bones of the old Charleston in its narrow streets, the same cobblestones that once carried chains and secrets. He rented a small room near the market and spent his days walking. Every step was an excavation. He saw where the auction block had stood, now covered by a fountain that children played around. He saw where the Whitford mansion had once loomed proud. Now it was half ruined, ivy crawling over its walls like forgiveness taking root. At night, he sat at his desk and wrote letters to newspapers and universities. His mother's story, the one Eleanor tried to bury in gold and shame, was finally going to be printed. But not everyone wanted the truth to rise. 2 nights after his arrival, Isaac received a visitor. The knock came just after midnight. He opened the door to find an older woman standing in the rain, her hair wrapped in a dark shawl. Her eyes were pale, but her posture carried the weight of someone used to command. "You're the one publishin' that book?" she asked. Isaac hesitated. "Depends who's askin'." She stepped into the light. "My name's Miss Althea Langston. My grandmother was Eleanor Whitford's sister. The name struck like a bell. Isaac gestured for her to come in. She sat stiffly, refusing tea. "I read some of your pages already," folks whisper fast in Charleston. "They say you aim to drag the Whitford name through the mud." Isaac smiled without humor. "Ma'am, that name was already dragged. I'm just showing who was holding the rope." And Althea's mouth tightened. Eleanor wasn't evil. She did what she thought she had to. "She sold her grandchildren," Isaac said flatly. "She saved her daughters from ruin," Althea countered. "The law wouldn't have spared them." "You think the world forgives women for their sins easier than men?" Isaac stared at her. "My mother carried that shame her whole life. She forgave her, but forgiveness don't erase the truth. It just lets the dead rest easier." Althea lowered her eyes. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking clock. Then she said quietly, "There's something you don't know. Eleanor didn't die in that house." Isaac blinked. "What do you mean?" "She disappeared," Althea whispered. "Vanished one night. Left her wealth, her servants, everything. Some said she walked into the marsh herself. Others said the ghosts came for her." Isaac felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the truth ain't always what the livin' think it is," Althea said, standing. "Sometimes the dead got one more story to tell." Then she turned and left, her shawl fluttering like a crow's wing. That night, Isaac couldn't sleep. He dreamed of the old house, of the nursery with its fading handprint. The sound of a cradle creaking echoed in his ears. When he woke, his hands were trembling. He looked at the unfinished manuscript on the desk. The final chapter, the one he'd avoided writing, remained blank. The chapter titled, "The Widow's Reckoning." So he went back. The mansion stood in ruin, half swallowed by vines and mist. The front door hung open like a wound. Inside, the air was thick with damp and silence. The parlor where Clara had faced the ghost still smelled faintly of ash and magnolia. Isaac walked up the staircase, lantern in hand. Each step creaked like a heartbeat. He reached the nursery, the room where the curse had ended, or so he thought. The cradle was gone. In its place stood a small, weathered table. On it, wrapped in a decaying shawl, was a single object, a leather-bound ledger. He opened it. Inside were names written in careful ink, hundreds of them. Men, women, children. Beside each name, a number. Prices. At the very end, one final entry stood apart from the rest. "Is greater than Eleanor Whitford, no price listed. Paid in full." Isaac's throat tightened. The candle flickered. He heard it then, the soft hum of the same lullaby his mother had heard years before. A voice, faint as wind through reeds, whispered, "Now it's finished." The flame went out. When Isaac returned to town at dawn, he carried the ledger under his coat. He locked himself in his room and began to write, the final words of his book pouring like confession. "Is greater than, in Charleston, wealth was built on names erased from ledgers, but sometimes the ink runs backward. Sometimes the forgotten write themselves back into history." He sent the finished manuscript north to a publisher in Boston. It was printed 6 months later, banned in half the South, and celebrated everywhere else. And when the first copy arrived back in Charleston, Isaac walked it to the harbor, tore out the title page, and tossed it into the sea. "For you, Mama," he whispered. "For all of them." The tide carried the page away. Years later, people swore they could still hear a harmonica playing near the ruins of the Whitford estate on humid nights. Some said it was the wind. Some said it was the widow herself, finally at peace. But those who knew the story best, those who had read the ledger of names, said it wasn't the dead at all. It was the sound of truth, still humming, refusing to be buried again. By the turn of the century, Charleston had changed its clothes, but not its bones. The grand houses still stood, whitewashed and proud, their porches heavy with the perfume of wisteria. Tourists strolled along the Battery, unaware that beneath their feet lay a city built on unmarked graves. But something new had begun to bloom amid the magnolias, a quiet reckoning. It started with a book. Isaac Whitford's The Ledger of Names had crossed oceans and decades. It was studied in universities up north, whispered about in parlors down south. The Whitford family, once a symbol of old Charleston's dignity, had become its haunting reminder. In 1901, the Charleston Historical Society announced a project that shocked the city's elite: the creation of the Whitford Memorial Archive, a museum dedicated to truth, labor, and remembrance. And at its heart, under glass, lay the original ledger Isaac had found in the decaying mansion, the one with prices beside human lives. No longer hidden, no longer silent. People came from everywhere to see it. Scholars, descendants, the curious. Mothers brought their children and read the names out loud, one by one. Miriam, aged 12. Tobias, aged 19. Clara, daughter of Eleanor. Each name spoken was a resurrection, each tear a kind of baptism. And on the wall beside it hung a photograph of Isaac himself, his eyes steady, his mouth neither smiling nor frowning, but full of peace. Below the frame was his last recorded quote: "Is greater than, the past is not dead soil. It grows into everything we are brave enough to plant." A generation later, another Whitford returned. Her name was Eliza Ruth Whitford, Isaac's granddaughter. She came from Chicago with her husband and 2 children, carrying a single violet in her hand. When she stepped into the museum, the air smelled faintly of old paper and rain. A curator greeted her softly. "Are you a descendant?" Eliza nodded. "Of both lines." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The man simply bowed his head and led her to the glass case. There, among the lists of sales and debts, Eliza traced her finger down to the final entry: Eleanor Whitford, paid in full. She pressed the violet against the glass. "It's finished," she whispered. But something deep in her, something carried through the blood, knew it wasn't truly finished. The past never ends. It changes shape. It breathes through those who remember. That evening, Eliza drove to the ruins of the old Whitford plantation, now overgrown and hushed. Fireflies drifted over the marsh like lost souls. The house was long gone, but the foundations remained: a few bricks, a chimney, and a fig tree growing stubbornly through what used to be the parlor floor. She stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of cicadas and water. Then she unpacked something from her bag: a small wooden flute carved with initials worn by time. She lifted it to her lips and played a few soft notes. The tune was one her grandmother had taught her, a tune her own mother said came from the quarters, passed down from a woman who once hummed to herself while washing clothes. The melody drifted into the swamp, gentle and sad, and for a moment, the wind carried another sound, with it a woman's voice, low and tired, humming the same tune back. Eliza smiled. "Rest easy," she murmured. Then she turned to leave. In the years that followed, the ledger of names became required reading in Southern schools. Statues came down. New ones rose of women carrying baskets, men holding tools, children standing free. The Whitford Memorial expanded into a full museum called the House of Memory. Its entrance bore a single inscription, carved into stone: "Is greater than." They were not property. They were people, and they will never be forgotten. Visitors left flowers, ribbons, sometimes letters. One day, a schoolteacher found a note tucked beneath the ledger. The handwriting was neat but trembling. "Is greater than, my family once owned people. My family once were people who were owned. Both truths live in me now. I choose the one that heals." No one ever claimed it. But the curators decided to frame it anyway. It hung by the entrance for decades. When the century turned again and digital screens replaced ledgers, the names lived on in an online archive. Millions could search their ancestry, trace their bloodlines back through the same names Isaac had rescued from the mud. Some found pride. Some found shame. Most found both. And every year, on the anniversary of Isaac's death, a small group gathered by the Charleston shore. They carried candles and sang the song Eliza had played by the swamp. The harmonies rose into the night air, soft but unwavering. On calm nights, when the tide was low, people said they could still hear another voice, join in faint and far away. A woman's voice. Some said it was Eleanor, finally forgiving herself. Others said it was the enslaved woman she'd betrayed, singing the world back toward mercy. Maybe it was both. As the candles floated out into the water, The crowd always fell silent for one final reading. Isaac's closing words from The Ledger of Names is greater than, "History is not the weight we carry. It is the story we choose to tell. And when we tell it right, even the dead begin to breathe again." The sea swallowed the light one by one, and the wind carried the song away. And somewhere, beyond time and tide, Charleston's ghosts finally slept.